The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellie's Air Force Base as Major Kestrel Wraith Nakamura powered down her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The aircraft's canopy hissed open, revealing a pilot whose calm demeanor belied the storm brewing in the Tactical Operations Center. What had started as a routine training exercise over the Nevada desert had become something far more complex when four F-22 Raptors surrounded her aging fighter jet in what could only be described as a deliberate intercept. The tower recordings would later reveal the confusion in the controllers' voices as they watched the formation close in on the lone F-16. "Wraith, you have 4 bogies approaching your 6, came the crackling transmission. But Kestrel had already seen them, sleek, angular death machines that represented the pinnacle of American air superiority. The Raptors had materialized from nowhere, their stealth technology rendering them invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. "Raptor Flight, this is Wraith. State your intentions," she had transmitted, her voice steady despite the tactical disadvantage. 4 against 1 was never favorable odds, even in training. The response came from the lead Raptor, call sign Viper. "Wraith, you are to follow us to restricted airspace. No deviation from course." As her boots touched the tarmac, Kestrel noticed the unusual activity surrounding her aircraft. Ground crews who normally handled routine post-flight inspections were being replaced by specialists she didn't recognize. Men in dress blues stood at a respectful distance, their ribbons and insignia indicating ranks that commanded attention. But it was the older colonel approaching her that made her heart skip. His weathered face bore the unmistakable expression of someone who had seen too much combat and recognized something others had missed. "Major Nakamura," the colonel said, his voice carrying decades of authority. "I'm Colonel Harrison. We need to talk." His eyes weren't on her face but on her aircraft, specifically on the fuselage where faded numbers had been painted over years ago. Numbers that most people would never notice, but to those who knew what to look for, they told a story. The story began 3 years earlier in the mountains of Afghanistan, where a young lieutenant had earned her call sign not through bravado or luck, but through an act of courage that had saved an entire forward operating base. The official records were classified, buried in files that few would ever read. But aircraft, like elephants, have long memories. Colonel Harrison's fingers traced the barely visible outline of the old numbers on her F-16's nose. "Tell me, Major," he said quietly, "do you remember forward operating base Shank?" The wind across the desert carried the scent of jet fuel and possibility. Around them, the normal sounds of military aviation continued, engines spooling up, radio chatter, the distant boom of supersonic aircraft. But in this moment, standing beside her faithful Fighting Falcon, Kestrel felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. She remembered everything about that night in the Hindu Kush Mountains. How could she forget? The memories were seared into her consciousness like afterimages from a lightning strike. The desperate radio calls for close air support, the weather that had grounded every other aircraft in the theater, the impossible decision to launch solo into conditions that violated every safety protocol ever written. "I remember," she said simply, her voice barely audible above the Nevada wind. Colonel Harrison nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared frequency. He had been there that night, not in the air but on the ground, watching his Marines fight for their lives against overwhelming odds. He had heard her voice on the radio, calm and professional as she painted targets with laser precision in zero visibility conditions. The Raptors that had escorted her back to base were now parked in a distant hangar, their pilots likely debriefing about the curious intercept mission they had been ordered to execute. They had been told only that a routine training flight needed to be redirected, nothing about the significance of the aircraft they were escorting or the woman who flew it. But Colonel Harrison knew. He had spent months trying to track down the pilot who had saved his men that night. The paperwork had been deliberately obscured, the aircraft reassigned, the pilot transferred to different commands. Someone had wanted the story buried, but aircraft maintenance records were harder to alter than personnel files. "Major," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command decision, "how would you feel about a new assignment?" Kestrel looked at her F-16, then at the colonel. The Fighting Falcon had been her companion through countless missions, its systems as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The aircraft bore scars from training exercises and the occasional bird strike, but it had never failed her. Like her, it was older than the cutting-edge platforms that dominated modern warfare, but experience had taught her that age often brought wisdom. "Depends on the assignment, sir," she replied. The colonel smiled, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. "How do you feel about training the next generation of fighter pilots?" he asked. "And specifically, how do you feel about showing them what real combat experience looks like?" The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Around them, the daily rhythm of military aviation continued its eternal dance of preparation and readiness, but Kestrel sensed that something fundamental was about to change. 3 hours later, she sat in a classified briefing room deep within Nelly's Air Force Base, surrounded by officers whose name tags read like a who's who of American military aviation. The briefing slides showed statistics that painted a troubling picture: pilot retention rates at historic lows, training accidents increasing, and a growing gap between simulation-based education and real-world combat experience. "The problem," explained Brigadier General Martinez, a slight woman whose diminutive stature belied her reputation as one of the most aggressive pilots in the Air Force, "is that we're training pilots to fight the last war, not the next one. Our newest pilots have incredible technical skills but lack the tactical judgment that comes from real combat experience." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Modern warfare was evolving faster than training programs could adapt. The next generation of pilots would face threats that current doctrine barely acknowledged: hybrid warfare, cyber attacks on aircraft systems, adversaries who understood American tactics because they had studied them for decades. "Major Nakamura," the general continued, "your experience in Afghanistan represents exactly the kind of tactical flexibility we need to instill in our pilots. The ability to make split-second decisions under impossible conditions. The judgment to know when to break protocol to achieve mission success." Kestrel studied the faces around the table. These were warriors who had earned their positions through competence and dedication, but she could see the concern in their eyes. The military was facing a crisis of experience. Too many of the combat veterans were leaving the service, taking their hard-won knowledge with them. "What exactly are you proposing, ma'am?" she asked. General Martinez leaned forward. "We want you to develop a new training program, something that bridges the gap between simulation and reality. We want you to teach pilots how to think like combat veterans, not just how to fly like test pilots." The proposal was ambitious and fraught with challenges. How do you simulate the psychological pressure of combat? How do you teach judgment that comes from facing life-and-death decisions? How do you prepare pilots for scenarios that haven't been imagined yet? But as Kestrel looked around the room, she realized that this was exactly the kind of challenge she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire career. Every difficult mission, every impossible decision, every moment of doubt overcome, it had all led to this opportunity. "I'll need complete autonomy over curriculum development," she said, "and I'll need access to pilots who aren't afraid to fail." The general smiled. "Done. When can you start?" The next morning, Kestrel stood on the flight line as the sun painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her F-16 sat nearby, but today she wasn't flying. Instead, she was watching as a new group of pilots prepared for their first day in what would become known as the Wraith program, a training regimen that would push the boundaries of conventional pilot education. The 12 pilots selected for the program represented the best of their generation. Fresh from advanced training, They possessed technical skills that exceeded anything previous generations had achieved. They could execute complex maneuvers with precision, manage multiple system failures simultaneously, and communicate effectively under stress. But they had never faced an enemy who shot back. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, the program's first female participant, approached Kestrel with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. "Major, I've reviewed your service record. The available portions anyway. I have to ask, is it true what they say about Afghanistan?" Kestrel considered the question carefully. The young pilot deserved an honest answer, but some truths were too complex for simple explanations. "What matters isn't what happened in Afghanistan," she said finally. "What matters is what we learn from it. What matters is being ready for whatever comes next." The training began with a simple exercise: navigate to a target, identify threats, and execute a successful mission. But unlike traditional training, this exercise included variables that couldn't be programmed into a simulator: weather conditions that changed by the minute, communications equipment that failed at critical moments, opposition forces that adapted their tactics in real time. Within hours, the carefully planned exercise had devolved into chaos. Half the pilots had lost contact with their wingmen. 3 had been shot down by ground-based threats they hadn't expected. 2 had successfully reached their targets but failed to properly identify them before engaging. Only one pilot, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a quiet officer from Idaho, had successfully completed the mission. But his success had come at a cost that made everyone uncomfortable. He had deliberately misled his wingman about his intentions, effectively using him as a decoy to draw enemy fire. Tactically brilliant, morally questionable. That evening, in the debrief session, the room was tense with unspoken criticism. The pilots who had been shot down were frustrated by the unrealistic nature of the exercise. Those who had survived were questioning whether Morrison's tactics were appropriate for American pilots. "Let me ask you something," Kestrel said, her voice cutting through the murmur of complaints. "How many of you have ever been in a situation where following the rules meant people died?" The room fell silent. These were pilots who had trained extensively, but none had faced the brutal calculus of combat where perfect solutions didn't exist. "Morrison," she continued, "made a choice that saved the mission but cost him his wingman. In the real world, that might have meant saving 100 Marines on the ground while sacrificing his best friend. Was it the right choice?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. There was no easy answer, and that was exactly the point. Real combat wasn't about following procedures. It was about making impossible decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences. Lieutenant Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ma'am, I didn't know he would get shot down. I was trying to create a diversion, not get him killed." "But you were willing to accept that risk," Kestrel observed. "You made a command decision that prioritized mission success over individual safety. That's exactly the kind of thinking that combat requires." The other pilots looked at Morrison with a mixture of respect and unease. They were beginning to understand that the Wraith program wasn't just about advanced tactics. It was about confronting the moral complexity of warfare. Over the following weeks, the exercises became increasingly sophisticated. Pilots faced scenarios where every option carried unacceptable costs. They learned to make decisions based on incomplete information, to trust their instincts when instruments failed, and to accept responsibility for outcomes they couldn't fully control. But the most important lesson was yet to come. It arrived on a Tuesday morning when the program's routine was shattered by an emergency notification. A commercial airliner had gone missing over the Pacific, and search and rescue operations were being mobilized. The Wraith program pilots were being called to participate in a real-world mission. Standing on the flight line as her pilots prepared for their first actual combat deployment, Kestrel felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that came with sending people into danger. These weren't the same pilots who had arrived months earlier. They had been transformed by experiences that no simulator could replicate. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez approached her with the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty she had shown on the first day. But now it was tempered by something deeper, the understanding that real consequences awaited beyond the horizon. "Major," she said, "whatever happens out there, I want you to know that this program has changed how I think about everything. Not just flying, but leadership, responsibility, courage. Thank you for showing us what it means to be a warrior." As the aircraft disappeared into the morning sky, Kestrel remained on the flight line, watching until the last contrail faded into the blue. She thought about the young lieutenant she had been in Afghanistan, facing impossible odds with nothing but training and determination. She thought about the Marines who had lived because she had been willing to break protocol and risk everything. Most of all, she thought about the future, about the battles these pilots would fight, the decisions they would make, and the lives they would save. The Wraith program was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. The missing airliner was located 6 hours later, floating intact in the Pacific after an emergency water landing. The search and rescue operation that followed would become a textbook example of precision flying and tactical coordination. But for those who knew the full story, it was something more. It was proof that the old ways of thinking about pilot training were no longer sufficient. Lieutenant Morrison, the pilot who had made the morally ambiguous decision during training, was credited with locating the aircraft's emergency beacon in conditions that had defeated more experienced search teams. His willingness to take calculated risks, honed during months of impossible scenarios, had saved 247 lives. But it was Lieutenant Commander Vasquez who provided the mission's most memorable moment. When weather conditions deteriorated beyond safe operating limits, she made the decision to continue the rescue operation despite direct orders to return to base. Her aircraft, battered by winds that exceeded design specifications, successfully guided Coast Guard vessels to survivors who would have been lost in the darkness. The after-action reports would note her violation of direct orders. They would also note that her actions had saved lives that would have been lost if she had followed protocol. The complexity of the situation embodied everything the Wraith program had tried to teach, that real leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibility for breaking rules in service of a higher purpose. Standing in the debriefing room 3 days later, Kestrel looked at the faces of her pilots. They had returned from their first real mission changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. They had seen the gap between training and reality, between simulation and consequence, between following orders and making command decisions. "What you accomplished out there," she began, "wasn't just a successful rescue operation. It was proof that the skills we've been developing here, the ability to think critically under pressure, to make difficult decisions with incomplete information, to accept responsibility for outcomes. These skills are exactly what the next generation of conflicts will require." The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than she had encountered on the first day. This was the silence of professionals who had been tested and proven themselves. This was the silence of warriors who understood the weight of their responsibilities. General Martinez, who had observed the rescue operation from the Tactical Operations Center, stepped forward. "Major Nakamura, the success of this program has exceeded our most optimistic projections. The Pentagon is requesting a full briefing on your training methodologies. They want to know if the Wraith program can be scaled up to train pilots across all branches of the military." The implications were staggering. If successful, the program could transform how America prepared its pilots for the conflicts of the future. But success would bring new challenges: bureaucratic resistance, budget constraints, and the inevitable attempts to standardize what had worked precisely because it couldn't be standardized. "General," Kestrel replied, The program works because it's small, flexible, and focused on developing judgment rather than following procedures. If we try to scale it up without preserving those essential characteristics, we'll lose what makes it effective. The tension in the room was palpable. Military organizations were designed for standardization, for processes that could be replicated and measured. But the Wraith program's success came from its ability to adapt to individual pilots, to create unique challenges that couldn't be anticipated or programmed. "What do you propose?" the general asked. Kestrel had been thinking about this moment for weeks, knowing that success would inevitably lead to pressure for expansion. Instead of scaling up, we scale out. We create multiple small programs, each led by combat veterans who understand the principles but can adapt them to their specific contexts. We train the trainers, not the pilots. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of creating a single large program, they would develop a network of smaller programs, each maintaining the flexibility and adaptability that made the original successful. It would require a new kind of military thinking, one that valued decentralized excellence over centralized control. But first, they needed to prove that the concept could work beyond the controlled environment of Nelly's Air Force Base. They needed to test it in the real world, under actual combat conditions. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Intelligence reports indicated increasing tensions in the South China Sea, where American allies were requesting enhanced training support. The Wraith program would be deployed to the Pacific, where its pilots would work alongside international partners to develop new tactical approaches to modern warfare. As Kestrel prepared for the deployment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The young lieutenant who had flown solo into impossible weather to save Marines in Afghanistan had become a major responsible for reshaping how America prepared its pilots for war. The aircraft that had carried her through that night, now bearing different numbers but the same scars, would accompany her to the Pacific. But this time, she wouldn't be flying alone. The pilots of the Wraith program would be with her, ready to face whatever challenges awaited beyond the horizon. They had learned the lessons of Afghanistan, but they were preparing for conflicts that hadn't been imagined yet. The C-17 transport aircraft that carried the Wraith program's equipment to the Pacific also carried something less tangible but equally important: the knowledge that American military aviation was evolving. The old assumptions about pilot training, about the relationship between simulation and reality, about the nature of combat itself, were being challenged by a new generation of warriors who understood that the future would be unlike anything they had faced before. Standing on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, as it cut through the blue waters of the Pacific, Kestrel watched her pilots prepare for operations that would test everything they had learned. The aircraft carrier's flight deck was a symphony of controlled chaos, jets launching and recovering, crews moving with practiced precision, the constant awareness that any mistake could be fatal. But there was something different about the Wraith program pilots. They moved with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from having been tested in ways that traditional training couldn't replicate. They had learned to trust their judgment, to make decisions based on incomplete information, to accept responsibility for outcomes they couldn't fully control. Lieutenant Morrison, who had become the program's unofficial leader after his success in the rescue operation, approached her with a tactical problem that demonstrated how much their thinking had evolved. "Major, we're being asked to develop a training scenario for our allied partners that simulates a complex multi-domain operation. But every time we try to create a realistic scenario, we end up with situations that don't have clear solutions." "That's exactly the point," Kestrel replied. "Real combat doesn't have clear solutions. It has choices, and each choice carries consequences. The best we can do is prepare pilots to make informed decisions and accept responsibility for the outcomes." The conversation was interrupted by the general quarters alarm. This wasn't a drill. Chinese military aircraft had been detected approaching the carrier group, and all pilots were being called to readiness stations. The theoretical was about to become very real. As Kestrel strapped into her F-16 for what might be her last flight in the aircraft that had carried her through so many challenges, she felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and anticipation that preceded combat operations. But this time, she wasn't alone. The pilots of the Wraith program were launching alongside her, ready to face whatever waited beyond the horizon. The Chinese aircraft maintained a respectful distance, but their presence was a reminder that the world was changing. The comfortable assumption that American military superiority would persist indefinitely was being challenged by adversaries who had studied American tactics and developed countermeasures. But as Kestrel looked at the formation of aircraft surrounding her, a mixture of F-16s, F-18s, and the occasional F-22, she felt a quiet confidence. These weren't just pilots following procedures. They were warriors who had been prepared for exactly this kind of ambiguous, high-stakes situation. The intercept proceeded without incident, but the psychological impact was profound. The pilots of the Wraith program had faced a real potential combat situation and responded with the calm professionalism that their training had been designed to develop. They had proven that the program's emphasis on judgment and decision-making under pressure was exactly what modern warfare required. That evening, in the carrier's ready room, the debrief session revealed just how much the pilots had internalized the lessons of the past months. Instead of focusing on technical procedures, they discussed the psychological aspects of the encounter, how they had managed stress, how they had communicated under pressure, how they had prepared for multiple contingencies. The most important thing, observed Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, wasn't what we did. It was what we were prepared to do. We had thought through the possibilities, we had considered the consequences, and we were ready to make decisions based on incomplete information. The comment sparked a broader discussion about the nature of modern warfare. Traditional military thinking focused on overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. But the Wraith program had demonstrated that future conflicts would be won by pilots who could think critically under pressure, who could adapt to unexpected situations, and who could make command decisions without waiting for permission. As the USS Abraham Lincoln continued its patrol through the South China Sea, the Wraith program pilots began working with allied partners to develop new training approaches. The program's emphasis on judgment and decision-making resonated with international partners who faced similar challenges in preparing their pilots for modern warfare. But the real test came when they were asked to train pilots from a small allied nation that had recently acquired advanced fighter aircraft, but lacked the experience to use them effectively. The challenge was to compress years of tactical development into a few weeks of intensive training. The solution came from an unexpected source. Chief Master Sergeant Davis, the program's senior enlisted advisor, suggested that they use the same approach that had worked with the original Wraith program pilots, create impossible scenarios that forced pilots to rely on judgment rather than procedure. The problem, he explained, isn't that these pilots don't know how to fly their aircraft. It's that they don't know how to think like combat pilots. They've been trained to follow procedures, not to make decisions. The international training program that emerged from this insight would become a model for military cooperation. Instead of simply teaching technical skills, it focused on developing the cognitive abilities that modern warfare required. The ability to process information quickly, to recognize patterns, to make decisions under uncertainty. The success of the program attracted attention from military leaders around the world. Delegations from allied nations began requesting briefings on the Wraith program's methodologies. Defense contractors wanted to understand how the program's insights could be incorporated into training systems. But for Kestrel, the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. A message arrived from Afghanistan, from the Marine unit she had supported during that night in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The unit's current commander, who had heard about the Wraith program through military channels, wanted to express his gratitude. Major Nakamura, the message read, the Marines you saved that night have gone on to successful military careers. Several have become officers themselves. They often speak about the pilot who risked everything to provide close air support when no one else would fly. They say that experience taught them what real leadership looks like, someone who is willing to accept responsibility for difficult decisions, even when the outcome is uncertain. The message continued. What you're doing with the Wraith program embodies the same principles that saved our lives that night. You're teaching pilots to be leaders, not just technicians. You're preparing them for the moral complexity of warfare, not just the technical challenges. That's exactly what the next generation of conflicts will require. As Kestrel read the message on the flight deck of the Abraham Lincoln, watching the sun set over the Pacific, she realized that the Wraith program had achieved something unexpected. It had demonstrated that the lessons learned in the mountains of Afghanistan were applicable to the challenges of modern warfare. It had shown that the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure was as important as technical flying skills. But most importantly, it had proven that the military's approach to pilot training needed to evolve. The old model of teaching procedures and techniques was no longer sufficient. The future required pilots who could think critically, who could adapt to unexpected situations, and who could accept responsibility for outcomes they couldn't fully control. The program's success led to requests for expansion beyond the Air Force. The Navy wanted to adapt the principles for carrier-based operations. The Marines were interested in applications for close air support. Even the Army was exploring how the program's insights could be applied to helicopter operations. But with success came new challenges. Military bureaucracy was designed for standardization and control, not for the kind of flexible, adaptive thinking that the Wraith program embodied. There was pressure to systematize the program, to create standardized curricula that could be implemented across multiple bases. The moment we try to standardize this program, Kestrel warned in a briefing to Pentagon officials, we'll lose what makes it effective. The power comes from adapting to individual pilots, from creating unique challenges that can't be anticipated. If we turn it into a checklist, we'll just have another conventional training program. The tension between innovation and institutionalization was a constant challenge. Military organizations needed consistency and predictability, but the Wraith program's success came from its ability to be inconsistent and unpredictable. How do you preserve the creative chaos that makes innovation possible while still maintaining the discipline that military operations require? The answer came from an unexpected source: the pilots themselves. The original Wraith program graduates had begun to assume leadership roles throughout the military, and they were naturally incorporating the program's principles into their own commands. They were creating a network of influence that spread the program's ideas without requiring formal institutionalization. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, now promoted to commander and leading her own squadron, had implemented Wraith program principles in her unit's training. Instead of following standardized procedures, her pilots were encouraged to develop their own approaches to tactical problems. The result was a squadron that consistently outperformed larger, more experienced units. Lieutenant Morrison, now a captain, had been assigned to the Air Force Academy, where he was quietly revolutionizing how future officers were taught to think about leadership and decision-making. His cadets were learning that successful military officers needed to be adaptive thinkers, not just skilled technicians. The informal network of Wraith program graduates was accomplishing something that formal programs couldn't. It was changing the culture of military aviation from within. The ideas were spreading organically, adapted to local conditions and specific challenges, maintaining their effectiveness while reaching a broader audience. But the program's most significant test was yet to come. Intelligence reports indicated that adversaries were developing new capabilities designed specifically to counter American military advantages. The next conflict would be unlike anything American pilots had faced before, requiring exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that the Wraith program had been designed to develop. As Kestrel prepared for her next assignment, leading a classified program to develop countermeasures against emerging threats, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The young lieutenant who had flown solo into impossible weather had become a major responsible for reshaping American military aviation. The aircraft that had carried her through that night was finally being retired, but its legacy would live on in the pilots who had learned to think like warriors. The ceremony marking the retirement of her F-16 was attended by pilots from around the world. The aircraft that had served faithfully through countless missions was being donated to a museum, where it would stand as a symbol of the evolution of military aviation. But for those who knew the full story, it represented something more: the transformation of a young pilot into a leader who had helped prepare the military for the challenges of the future. Standing beside the aircraft one final time, Kestrel placed her hand on the fuselage where the old numbers had been painted over years ago. The physical evidence of that night in Afghanistan was gone, but the lessons learned had shaped everything that followed. The Wraith program, the international training initiatives, the network of innovative thinkers throughout the military, all of it traced back to a single moment when a young pilot had chosen to break protocol to save lives. General Martinez, now wearing the stars of a two-star general, approached for the final ceremony. "Major Nakamura," she said, "this aircraft represents more than just a successful military career. It represents the evolution of how we think about warfare, about leadership, about the responsibilities that come with military service. The pilots you've trained, the programs you've developed, the ideas you've championed, they're already shaping the future of military aviation." The general paused, then continued, "I have one final assignment for you. The Pentagon has approved the creation of a new command structure dedicated to developing innovative approaches to military training. They want you to lead it. The position comes with a promotion to lieutenant colonel and the resources to implement your ideas on a global scale." As Kestrel considered the offer, she looked at the faces of the pilots who had gathered for the ceremony. These were the men and women who would fight the next war, who would face challenges that current doctrine couldn't anticipate. They deserved leaders who understood that the future would be unlike anything they had experienced before. "General," she replied, "I accept the assignment, but I have one condition: we do this right. No shortcuts, no compromises, no attempts to standardize what works because it can't be standardized. We create something that can adapt and evolve, something that can respond to threats we haven't imagined yet." The handshake that followed sealed more than just a personnel assignment. It represented a commitment to transforming how America prepared its military leaders for the challenges of the future. The Wraith program had been just the beginning. The real work was about to start. As the ceremony concluded and the participants began to disperse, Kestrel remained beside her retired F-16 for a few final moments. The aircraft had carried her through the most challenging and rewarding years of her career. It had been her companion through impossible weather, her platform for saving lives, her symbol of the evolution from following orders to making command decisions. But now it was time to move forward. The future of military aviation wouldn't be determined by individual aircraft or even individual pilots. It would be shaped by the ideas and approaches that prepared entire generations of military leaders for the complexities of modern warfare. The sun was setting over Nellis Air Force Base as Kestrel finally walked away from the aircraft that had defined her career. Behind her stood a symbol of the past, a faithful machine that had served with distinction. Ahead lay the challenges of the future, the responsibility to prepare America's military for conflicts that hadn't been imagined yet. The young lieutenant who had flown solo into impossible weather to save Marines in Afghanistan had become Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel, Wraith Nakamura, commander of the newly created Adaptive Military Training Command. The aircraft that had carried her through that transformation was being retired, but its legacy would live on in the pilots who had learned to think like warriors, to make decisions under pressure, and to accept responsibility for outcomes they couldn't fully control. The story that had begun with a single pilot making an impossible decision in the mountains of Afghanistan would continue with thousands of pilots learning to make similar decisions around the world. The Wraith program had demonstrated that the future of warfare would be won not by superior technology alone, but by superior thinking. And that thinking would be shaped by leaders who understood that the greatest battles are fought not in the sky, but in the minds of those who dare to challenge the impossible.